Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So last week I went over an article from someone who is now a writer for D&D, and the article was, "Women are destroying science fiction, but that's okay, they created it." And I went over the article to show that not only is she being internally inconsistent with everything that she says, but even if you take a progressive, quote unquote progressive, definition of science fiction and how the genres are separated, it still makes no sense. And my conclusion was fairly short, but I concluded saying, how do we defend against these people and their destruction of things like science fiction and fantasy? Because that's what she's talking about, the destruction of science fiction and fantasy. And I said, well, we need to draw a line in the sand and say, you stop here. You go no further. And if you want to listen to that video, I'll link it in the description and at the end of this one as well. But my point this week is to talk about that line in the sand, about not only where it should be drawn, but how to draw it. And it will come as no surprise to people who listen to my videos a lot that I would say the solution of where to draw that line and how to draw it comes through heroism. Because that's what this channel is about, and my comics as well. The channel's name is The Fourth Age. My comic company is The Fourth Age Comics. Why? Because the Fourth Age is the Greek equivalent of the Age of Heroes. And I think we're due for that again, an Age of Heroes, at the very least in a literary sense, but I would hope in a personal sense for individuals as well. And speaking of my comics and graphic novels, there are 2 links in the description and on the pinned comment, which you can click on to go over to Indiegogo and order either my superhero graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes, or my new fantasy graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer. It is a return to the basics of low fantasy, something I'm going to talk a little bit more about in this video. It's in the vein of Kull and Conan and Solomon Kane, and if you want to know more about the story, there are 11 lettered pages on the Indiegogo page for you to read from the first of that 66-page graphic novel. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art for that graphic novel in the background, so if that looks or sounds appealing to you at all in any way, click on those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels. But back to my topic of drawing this line in the sand. Now what I'm going to do, first of all, is go over some pop culture references according to entertainment. Then I'm going to go a little bit into what I would say is where a lot of people would enter into this discussion philosophically by talking a little bit about what Jordan Peterson is trying to do. And then I'm going to take all of that to its natural conclusion and talk about being heroic, once again, according to entertainment and how it plays out in our history and in our lives right now. So, to start off with a pop culture reference that everyone will be familiar with over the last 2 weeks is the movie The Sound of Freedom, and how you have these quote-unquote progressive people trying to downplay and get rid of, essentially, this movie, which is about child trafficking and about how evil a thing it is and pervasive a thing it is and how it still exists within our culture today and how we should get rid of it. But no, these progressive people are trying to downplay and get rid of this movie. Why? Well, you might say because these quote-unquote progressive people like to abuse children in one way or another, and I would agree with that. But here's the thing. If you look into history, you will see that up until really the modern period, someone abusing another person mentally was actually considered a much more heinous crime than them actually abusing them just physically. Because physical wounds can heal, but mental wounds, well, they can scar you in a much deeper way. They can affect you both mentally and physically and spiritually and destroy you. And the thing is that these quote-unquote progressive people need to take advantage of children mentally in order to propagate their ideology. This goes right back to Lenin with his quote that, "Give me 3 years to teach the children," or was it 4, "and I will give you 100 years of communism." This is exactly the mindset of the quote-unquote progressive ideology. Give us the children so that we can bend their minds towards our ideology, and we will be here for at least 100 years, if not more. And that's what we see within our school systems right now. And if you take that principle of violating someone mentally is much more harmful than violating them physically, you can see why, if their entire ideology depends on abusing the children mentally to begin with, then abusing them physically is not a great leap. It's just a natural extension of how they wish to propagate their entire ideology. And I'm not trying to downplay the physical aspect of physical abuse, not at all. I'm saying that it runs much deeper than most people actually think about. But also, and again, not to downplay the physical abuse part of it, there's an underlying reason why, a secondary reason why these quote-unquote progressive people want to get rid of this movie. And it's linked to the first. And it's the fact that it's showing people, especially men, that yes, you need to defend the innocent. And this is something that the quote-unquote progressives cannot stand. Because if you have manly men who are defending the innocent, then the innocent can't be used. And it halts this ideology in its tracks. And why I'm talking about this right now is because that defense of the innocent is a heroic act. It's a part of those two virtues of justice and fortitude, those two virtues which are back to back. Number one, saying justice itself is rendering to everyone what is their due, and these are innocent children. It is not due them this horrible existence, therefore I will defend them in a stalwart manner, which requires fortitude. Fortitude is the virtue that allows a person to suffer the slings and arrows of this world and still be virtuous in the way that he needs to be, especially just in the way he needs to be. And that's really part and parcel of the whole quote-unquote progressive ideology. It's saying, look, being stalwart and courageous and steadfast, those things, if you do them, you're gonna take some personal hits. And we're all about comfort. Don't you want comfort? So just give up fortitude in any way, so that once you give up that fortitude, there's no one there left to defend the innocent, there's no one there left to fight for justice, and then their ideology can take full sway. Secondarily, let's look at the song that just came out this week. Try that in a small town, and how these quote-unquote progressive people are smearing it with everything that they can get their hands on, trying to prove that it's an ist or phobic song of one kind or another that promotes violence, even though there are songs which are much, much more promotions of violence out there that they never say a word about. Why are they going after it? Well, because again, this is about fortitude, and this is about justice. This is people in the small town saying, we're neighbors, we know each other, and we will defend each other. We will look and see an injustice occurring to our neighbor, and we will stand up for them. Once again, it is the virtues of justice and fortitude that they are trying to destroy. Now let's take another tack with this, and look at, as I said, the philosophical through a little bit of what Jordan Peterson has to say. A lot of people say that I touch on a lot of the same points as Jordan Peterson, but I would say he's dealing with a natural law argument, which is much more fundamental than what I'm arguing with my promotion of heroism. He's talking about a natural law argument for natural liberty. Very quickly, natural law being the constitutive aspects of human fulfillment, both for individuals and as a part of a society. But he's saying, at its heart, people need to take responsibility for their own actions. And that's the thing with responsibility. In taking responsibility for your actions, you're promoting what is known as natural liberty. You're saying, I am the author of my own actions, and therefore I have to be responsible for them. And primarily he's arguing against postmodernism, which is one of the underlying philosophies of quote-unquote progressivism. Why? Because progressivism and postmodernism before it and so many other strains of thought that feed into it are all fatalist ideologies. Well, honestly, more than ideologies, they're fatalist religions, almost. Fatalism is the idea that there are these larger forces that control your destiny, that control your fate. And so you really don't have to take responsibility here, here, and here, because you're not responsible, because you're not the author of your own actions. It's part of your fate. This is an idea that has continued on in the intellectual history of, at the very least, Western civilization, but I would say mankind itself throughout its history. If we go back to the ancient Greeks and their idea of the fates, that's fatalism. You can go back to the Stoics, read the works of Cicero and his talking about predicting the future, that's fatalism. You can go into the Christian period, where they have the Maniaeans, or the Gnostics, or the Pelagians. They're all in one way or another, fatalists. This is why we have Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century AD arguing against all of those groups that I just mentioned, saying, no, the will acts in a way where you are the author of every last thing that you do. It is your choice, and therefore it is your responsibility. Now, 2 quick notes there. Number 1, this is the definition of will that we still use today. And number 2, he's arguing from a Christian perspective, and someone might ask, how in the world can you have a will that is completely free in this way and still have the Christian ideas of providence and predestination? Well, it has to do with a very theological argument about the difference of the temporal versus the eternal, and how the temporal world exists within a superstructure of the eternal. But I'm not going over that. That's just to point you in the direction if you're wondering about that question. But the point being that this type of fatalism began to reemerge or have more and more sway several hundred years ago. You can go back to Occam or Descartes or Kant or Hegel, or more recently, philosophies like Nietzscheism or materialism, and then, of course, into things like postmodernism and quote-unquote progressivism, and see how they each have a fatalistic strain. That's why in quote-unquote progressivism, they say things like institutional oppression of one kind or another, or you're participating in whiteness, or because you're a man, you're automatically misogynist in this way and that. And there's no way that you can extract yourself from any of these things. What are they saying? They're saying, well, you have a destiny, you have a fate, it is fatalism. There is no way that you can get out of these things, and therefore it's a fatalistic way of looking at the world. And it also allows them to tell their followers that, it's not really your responsibility for all these things that are happening, so you can skip out on that. And also at its heart, this is one of the reasons why your quote-unquote progressive people despise rationality. Because if you have a free will, in the way that Augustine describes it, you are a rational creature. That is the principle of your existence, and you can use your reason. Why? Because in order for you to have that will, to choose between the many goods, then, first of all, you need to make a judgment. That judgment occurs through the use of your reason. Therefore, in order to have reason as we understand it today, you need to think of yourself as a rational creature. And they don't think of you as someone who has that will. You are controlled by larger forces. Therefore, it also destroys that idea that you are a rational creature. And this is nothing new. You can go back to Hume and Hobbes and the rest of them trying to say that, no, you are rational, but really it's the passions that are in control. Again, those are ideas of fatalism. But Peterson is saying, A, you need to take responsibility for your actions, and then B, you need to make some standards for yourself to live by. And those two things are connected. Usually they're connected in a much different way, because you go back to even Plato in the 4th century BC. He was very much a forward thinker, thinking that, yes, you need to take responsibility for your actions. This is a natural law way of thinking, but it should go from there that in this natural law way of thinking, you then understand natural law and then institute laws for your country and those things around you. Because, of course, those actual laws, as is supposed to be with our legal system, are supposed to be a reflection of natural law. But, of course, we've gotten rid of that entire idea, certainly over the last 100 years, that law should be based upon the ideas of natural law. But his third step after that, if you follow it along, is once he lays down the laws in his Perfect Society, as he's discussing it within the Laws, which is his seminal work, he says, after this point, what is it that a man will make into a law unto himself, so that he can make himself just and good and noble? This is exactly what Jordan Peterson is talking about, except, of course, within our society, that idea of law being based upon natural law has been destroyed. Therefore, he's saying, go back to the natural law idea that you need to take responsibility for your actions. You have a free will, therefore you are responsible for where you go and end up. And since we can't depend on the law, then we have to set up standards for ourselves, those laws which every man makes as a law unto himself, in order to be that just and good and noble person. And this is where I would say Jordan Peterson ends with his idea of touching just at the very tip what is known as moral liberty. And that's where I begin, with my ideas of heroism. Now, you might not want to call it moral liberty, but I'm here to say right now, you shouldn't balk at the idea of morality whenever anybody brings it up. Why? Because if you're looking around you right now and see all these political things going on and say that's not right, what are you doing? Well, you're making a moral judgment. Why? because politics, as a form of understanding, if you look at it rationally and logically, derives itself from moral philosophy. It is a branch of moral philosophy called public morals. Now, if you want to call it virtue liberty, you go right ahead. If you want to think of it in the ancient way of only the wise man can be free, that's exactly the same thing. They're all tied up together. Why? Because the idea of moral liberty is as follows. First of all, it proceeds upon natural liberty. If you don't have a secure footing of natural liberty, you can't have moral liberty. Moral liberty comes from the idea that, yes, you see, every path is open to you, and you can choose any one of them you want. Of course, you have to have the flip side if you take responsibility for those actions. But at the same time, you have to understand, just because every path is open to you doesn't mean every path is going to lead to a good end for you. And so you need to use your reason and extract from reality the rules of reality to find out when you make a decision whether or not it's going to turn out well or poorly for you. And this is the very inception point of virtue and heroism itself. Heroism, as it has been treated within Western civilization for a minimum of 3,000 years, is that a hero is a paragon of virtue. Those virtues are 4 in number and of a very specific order. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But what precedes them is right reason. That is to say, your reason in accord with reality. You need to hone your reason so that it calculates in accord with what is real. And from that, you can move into the charioteer of all the virtues, which is prudence, which is to say, making good decisions, which is to say, making decisions in accord with reality so that things will work out for you. And you want to do this, and it's called moral liberty because since A, we're limited and prone to mistakes, and our reason is not something which is always going to choose what is right, that is to say, what is in accord with reality, you can choose to follow a lie and then will yourself to move in that direction, and then it's going to turn out poorly for you. But here's the thing. When you do that, you're becoming a slave to that lie, to that bad information. So if you're going in that direction, you're using your natural liberty to do so, certainly, but you're going into a direction which is then enslaving you even more. That's why when you choose to act in accord with reality towards the virtues, which is a moral thing to do, then you're actually making yourself more and more free. And that's how you get into the virtues which come after prudence, which are justice and fortitude. So really, at its heart, what progressivism is a type of fatalism which says, no, you see, all of the moral choices are open to you so that you can do anything you want. Nothing can be called immoral. But the natural liberty, that's not really yours. There's a superstructure that controls your fate there. But the point is that, again, they're using a system whereby if you follow that in a rational way, none of that can actually occur. That's all a falsehood. You can't have any actual moral liberty unless you first have natural liberty. And even if you do have moral liberty, it is not to say that everything you choose to do is going to work out for you. So there's no constraint for you to be virtuous and moral. You can be quite the opposite. But again, this is all calculated under natural law, which is trying to delve into what constitutes human fulfillment, both as an individual and as part of a society. And if you go into that section of choosing where things turn out poorly for you over and over again, and you become a slave to error, you're not going to be fulfilled. And by the way, I always have to mention, this is the very heart of the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So now that we touched on first the practical and then the fundamental philosophical principles that underlie this way of thinking, let's now apply them to where exactly and how you draw this line in the sand. And again, I want to do so through looking at something which is just entertainment. It's just storytelling. Here's the thing. This idea, the idea of will and the individual, all of that, you may not realize, but it is constantly tied up with the idea of storytelling and the idea of entertainment. One of the fundamental places where the idea of the individual came from within Greek society was the fact that you had these plays being put on, and they were in amphitheaters, and so you had the actors wearing these exaggerated masks with exaggerated features so that the people in the cheap seats way in the back could actually tell one actor from another, one character from another. This led straight into one of the underlying ideas that led into the idea of the individual as expressed within one of the parents of our civilization, which is ancient Greece. And again, I always go back to Aristotle and his definition of story and how it is at once a rhetorical argument and a reflection of reality. What does it do at its basis, or at the very least can do at its basis? Well, certainly for us, we live in a time where we are so philosophically ignorant it is not even funny, but we still have story. And story can give us, at the very least, a release valve to explore these ideas in that same philosophical way. And with that in mind, I hope you will indulge me while I talk for a moment about Robert E. Howard. Because, well, my first love was history, my first degree was in history, and I'm very much of the opinion that was expressed by, who was it, C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton, I can't remember which one, who said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And I would say right now, where we are in the 2020s, this is exactly where the people in 1920 were. We have the exact same problem, and that is a problem of decadence and how to be a man when you're surrounded by nothing but decadence. Because, of course, apart from that, if you have no men, which are true men who understand virtue and sacrifice, justice and fortitude, then no one's there left to defend the innocent, and you're going to go straight into the things that they saw around them in the 1920s and the things that we see around us today in the 2020s. And Robert E. Howard is a good person to look at because not only did he write a character which is still relevant within our society today, Conan, but at the same time, this is what he was doing with his stories in part. He was trying to explore manliness because he had a problem within his own life. His problem was not unique, and it started certainly decades before him, but you had more and more these young boys being raised exclusively by their mother, and they didn't have a male role model, and so it gave them A, an unhealthy attachment to their mother, and B, a lack of understanding what it is to be a man. And we can see this in Robert E. Howard's life itself, because unfortunately, he used to joke to his friends that when his mother died, he was just going to kill himself. And they all thought it was a joke, until his mother died, and he walked out to his car, took a gun, put it to his head, and that was the end of Robert E. Howard. So, of course, if that's your attachment to your mother, I'm sorry, but that's unhealthy. And I would say that points exactly back to what he was trying to explore with his characters within his writings. And a lot of people have said to me, why would you make a comic like Crom the Destroyer, which is basically a rehashing of the ideas of Conan and the previous supporting characters like Kull, like Solomon Kane? Because he's an anti-hero. I would disagree. I would severely disagree, and you want to disagree with me, go right ahead, put it in the comments. But I would say that Conan is a picture of a hero, not an anti-hero. Why? Because Robert E. Howard began with the stories of Kull the King, and they didn't do very well. So he reshaped this character into Conan. And we see at the very first instance of Conan being shown in a story, it's the story of the Phoenix and the Sword, where Conan is a king, and he's a lawful good king, is what he is. And not only that, but Robert E. Howard goes nudge, nudge, wink, wink to his audience saying, yes, I understand. This is just Kull all over again, but go with it. Which happens when Conan picks up an axe, which is the preferred weapon of Kull, and then has what I would describe as racial memories of being Kull because he's his ancestor. But anyways, the point being that Robert E. Howard did not write these stories in any kind of chronological sequence or order. He would jump around all over the place within the life of Conan, but always under the idea that the first place that he put him was in the end of his life where he was a lawful good king. Now, he wasn't exactly the most virtuous even at that time, and he does continue on with his kingly progression even after that point. But when you take that into consideration, and then you go back to when he was younger, especially on the early stories where he first comes out from his barbaric origins and he meets a soothsayer that says, you're going to be a king one day, that bookends the entire thing with, you're going to be a king, and then he becomes a lawful good king. So what we see within the stories themselves is the progression of this man becoming a hero. He's not a hero within these stories itself, but he's moving towards that point. And again, we see this within the story of the Scarlet Citadel, where he is a king once more within a Robert E. Howard story. And His opponents have him cornered, and they say, you have two choices, death, or we can give you everything you ever wanted as a barbarian. Everything and more if you just give up this kingdom. And he says, no, kill me. I am not going to give these people up to despots. I freed them from a mad king. I will not be a tyrant, nor will I sacrifice them to tyrants. He ends up as a lawful, good king. He is a hero. But the point of why I'm going over this is there's a very interesting story that happens later on in his life called Across the Black River, where basically Robert E. Howard is setting him in the Old West. That's what it looks like when it is described. And you have these settlers all over the place, and he's basically a mercenary helping defend them, where you have a picture of both civilization and barbarism butting up against each other. And he says over and over again within this story that if the people who actually have the money purse and are controlling your civilization don't give you enough resources so that you can defend yourself against these savages, then savagery is going to rule. It's going to destroy you. And he says that civilization itself is just a temporary thing. It's always going to revert to savagery. Now, a lot of people would say this is him saying that savagery is superior to civilization. I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that what he is expressing within this story is the fact that civilization has its worth, but only a worth which is worth keeping if you are ready to defend it, if you are ready to put in the sacrifice necessary to keep it going. Because if you do not, then that luxury which overtakes the people in this story and he is condemning, if you go into that decadence of civilization, everything is going to end up barbaric once again. And this is the mindset of the entire thing, if you ask me. And this is what I want to concentrate on, because this is what I'm talking about within everything in this video. It is that stalwart fortitude that civilized men need to have in order to ensure that civilization continues. To draw a line in the sand and say, you can't cross this. And what it is the Aristotelian idea of the golden mean. That is to say, Aristotle says, if you have a piece of wood which is bent in one direction and is no good to you because you need it to be straight, in order to make it straight, you bend it back in the other direction. Not with the intent of bending it into that other direction to make it bowed in that secondary direction. No, with the intent of making it straight. If you continue in that other direction until it's bowed in the secondary direction, then it's still no good to you. You need to make the thing straight. This is the mean position, and this is what we need to do within our society today. Certainly, we need to fight against these people and bend our society and culture back towards what is an excess in the other direction, not with the intent of staying in that excess, but with the intent of making it straight and right and true again. And how do we know how to make it straight and right and true? How do we know where that line is? Through heroism. It's very interesting because, of course, Conan is built upon old Celtic myth. This is partly what I'm trying to do with my book. I'm going back into the old Celtic myth and drawing on that to build the character of Crom the Destroyer, which again is in the exact same position, slightly altered, that I have just described, because he is a king who was once a barbarian. He now sees the worth of civilization, but through a flaw in his character, he loses everything. And so what he must do in order to try to gain that civilization back is to use his barbaric nature in order to bring it back. And again, he must walk that fine line of the mean position, trying to regain civilization through what is essentially a barbaric life. That is my story of Crom the Destroyer. But again, the point being that it is these old Celtic myths that these characters are drawing from, especially characters like Conan. And here's the thing. Most people think of the King Arthur stories as being English myth. It's not. It's part of Celtic myth. There's old Celtic myth and there's new Celtic myth with your King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And I would say there's your heroic ideal right there. And most people would balk at that today, saying that chivalric nature of those characters is something to be looked down upon. We don't ascribe to that anymore. And I would say what you're doing is looking at that stories according to the way the progressives want you to look at them. Those stories are very easily manipulated Number one, because they come to us through a romantic storytelling. And number two, these quote unquote progressive people can twist and turn everything, especially romanticism and a focus on the emotion, directly to their cause. But that's not the heart of these stories themselves, nor the chivalry within which they try to promote. And this is expressed by looking both at that old version of the Celtic myth and the newer version, which is the Knights of the Round Table. You see, the old Celts had this idea of bonds. It's basically their word, but it binds them to their word in such a way that they can never give it up. If you want an equivalent that you might be able to access, think about the story of Herod, where he gave his word to his new wife's daughter that he would give her whatever it is she wanted if he did what she asked. And then she did it, and then she asked for something, which was the head of John the Baptist, which he did not want to give her, but because he gave his word, especially in front of all these other people, he could not stop from doing it. This is extremely similar to the idea of bonds within old Celtic mythology. And over again, you have these old Celtic heroes run into a situation where usually a woman comes up to them and says, help me, I'm an innocent, you need to promise me to do whatever it is I ask. And they say, sure, I will defend you, I will do whatever it is you ask. And then they ask something of them which will then lead to their destruction. And not only their destruction, but the destruction of kingdoms and entire nations outside of that. But if you get into the stories of the Knights of the Round Table, is a very interesting way that changes. I think most notably you would see it within Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where Sir Gawain has this woman rush up to him and say, help me, please, I'm an innocent, I need help. And Sir Gawain says, certainly, I will defend you, lady, against anything that comes against you. But he doesn't stop there. He continues his sentence and says, as long as it does not contradict my honor. And right there, that is the mean position. Because honor plays in directly to this entire thing. I always like to go back to Plato's definition of honor, which is very pithy. He says, honor consists in following the better, and in doing our utmost to effect the betterment of the worse when it admits of being bettered. What he's saying is that if you have a choice between what is good and what is better, you choose what is better. If you have a choice which can make something good into something better, you make it better. And certainly, if you have a choice between what is bad and what is good, you choose what is good. But the whole point underneath all of that is the only way you can calculate that scale of bad, good, better is by knowing what is best. Again, go back to that Conan quote from the movie. What is best in life? You need to understand that, again, through your reason, through examination and the testing ground of reality to make it right reason, to make yourself into a prudent individual. Then you can understand what is best in life. Then you can calculate what is good, better, best. Then you can be honorable by choosing always what is better when those choices are put in front of you and you exercise your will. And it gives you a standard whereby you can draw a line in the sand and say to others, this is a line you will not cross. Because at the same time, that's a line in the sand for you to say, this is a line I will not cross. And although it takes sacrifice and again, suffering the slings and arrows of this life to first draw that line and then defend it, it will not only be the thing which will stop these quote-unquote progressive people in their tracks, but it is also the mean position that allows every man to recognize and fulfill that voice within him that says, be virtuous and honorable, because that is how you are a true man. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description, one for my superhero graphic novels, the other for my low fantasy graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer. Click on those links and go on over and order your copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.